Imagine going to the doctor with a headache, and instead of prescribing painkillers, he pulls out a hand drill, straps you to a table, and starts boring a hole through your skull while you're fully conscious. No anesthesia, no steroids, just a sharp piece of metal grinding through bone until your brain's protective membrane is exposed, because medieval doctors genuinely believed this would cure you. Welcome to medieval medicine, where the treatments were often more terrifying than the diseases themselves. We're talking about physicians with filthy fingernails performing brain surgery, burning your hemorrhoids with red-hot irons as standard procedure, draining pints of blood from your veins because they thought it balanced your humors, and drilling holes in skulls for everything from migraines to mental illness to evil spirits. The truly horrifying part: people paid good money for these treatments. They trusted these doctors, and shockingly, some patients actually survived, which only convinced everyone that these nightmare procedures actually worked. Today, we're diving deep into the most disturbing, bizarre, and genuinely insane medical practices of the Middle Ages. From trepanation that removed chunks of your brain to bloodletting that killed more people than it saved, you're about to discover why surviving medieval healthcare was harder than surviving the diseases. If you're ready to never complain about getting a vaccine again, hit that subscribe button, because medieval medicine is about to get medieval. Let's begin. Let's start with the most famous and arguably most terrifying medieval medical procedure: trepanation. This is the practice of drilling, scraping, or cutting a hole directly through someone's skull until you expose the dura mater, the thick membrane protecting the brain. And yes, they did this while patients were fully awake. The procedure itself is ancient, dating back over 7,000 years to Neolithic times. By the medieval period, it had become a standard surgical technique that doctors performed with disturbing frequency. One particularly unfortunate individual had 52 holes drilled into his head over a 2-month period. Prince Philip of Orange underwent the operation 17 separate times. These weren't rare emergency procedures. This was considered normal medical practice. So why were medieval doctors so obsessed with drilling holes in people's heads? The reasons varied, but they all shared one common thread. Medieval physicians fundamentally misunderstood how the human body worked. They believed trepanation could release evil spirits, causing mental illness, epilepsy, or blindness. They thought it relieved pressure after head injuries, which, to be fair, sometimes it actually did. They also believed that stagnant blood trapped inside the skull would rot and turn into pus, so drilling holes allowed the bad blood to drain out before it spoiled. The Hippocratic doctors, whose teachings dominated medieval medicine, wrote extensively about trepanation in texts like On Wounds in the Head. They instructed physicians to drill carefully, watching for the dura mater at short intervals to avoid puncturing it and killing the patient instantly. By the time of Galen, 129–199 AD, trepanning was standard procedure for skull fractures, pressure relief, and drainage. Galen even recommended that doctors practice the technique on animals first, particularly Barbary apes. The actual procedure was as horrifying as you'd imagine. Medieval surgeons used sharpened pieces of flint, specialized drills called trepans, or even crude saws to cut through the skull. With zero anesthesia, patients endured unimaginable agony as the drill bit ground through bone, sending vibrations directly into their conscious brain. The sound alone, the grinding, scraping, cracking, must have been psychologically devastating. Here's a real medieval case that perfectly captures the insanity of this practice. Sen Faelad Mac Ailela, a young Irish chieftain, took a sword strike to the head during the Battle of Moirath in 637 AD. His skull was fractured badly, so monks at the Abbey of Tomrigan decided to save his life by not only removing a section of his skull, but actually cutting out part of his brain. Somehow, impossibly, he didn't just survive. He claimed the surgery made him better. According to Irish annals, his brain of forgetting was knocked out of him, giving him perfect memory for the rest of his life, and he became a respected scholar and poet. Stories like this, where patients miraculously survived and even improved, only reinforced medieval doctors' belief that trepanation worked. They had no understanding of survivorship bias, no concept of infection control, and no idea that many patients died days or weeks later from complications. All they saw was, we drilled a hole in his head and he got better, therefore drilling holes in heads cures people. The survival rate for trepanation was actually surprisingly high, considering the complete absence of sterile technique, antibiotics, or proper wound care. Archaeological evidence shows that many trepanned skulls display signs of healing, meaning the patients lived long enough for bone to regrow around the hole. This wasn't because medieval surgeons were skilled, it was because the human body is remarkably resilient and infection doesn't always set in immediately. But here's the darkest part. The bone pieces cut from skulls during trepanation were kept and worn as amulets or charms, believed to ward off evil spirits. In some cultures, these skull fragments were considered sacred objects, prized possessions passed down through families. Your grandmother's trepanned skull piece? That's a family heirloom now. Medieval trepanation wasn't rare, experimental, or reserved for desperate cases. It was routine surgery performed by respected physicians who genuinely believed they were healing people by drilling holes through their conscious skulls. And the patients? They paid for the privilege of experiencing it. If trepanation was medieval medicine's most dramatic procedure, bloodletting was its most common and arguably most deadly. For over 3,000 years, physicians believed that draining significant amounts of blood from sick people would cure virtually any ailment. Headache, bloodletting, fever, bloodletting, plague, definitely bloodletting. Feeling tired? That's because you have too much blood. Let's drain some out. This practice was based on the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Medieval doctors believed that illness resulted from an imbalance of these humours, and since Galen of Pergamum, 129–200 AD, declared blood the most dominant humour, removing excess blood became the go-to treatment for almost everything. Galen's influence cannot be overstated. His writings exceeded 2 million words, and his teachings dominated medical practice for over 1,000 years. The methods of bloodletting varied, but all involved deliberately making patients bleed. The most common technique was venesection, where doctors would open a vein, usually the median cubital vein at the elbow, with specialized instruments called lancets or fleams. Thumb lancets were small, sharp, two-edged blades that physicians carried in ivory or tortoiseshell cases like pocket knives. Fleams were multi-bladed devices with various sized blades that folded into cases, allowing doctors to choose how large an incision to make. The procedure was straightforward. Tie off the patient's arm with a tourniquet to make the vein bulge, slice it open with a lancet, and let the blood pour out into a bowl until the physician decided enough had been removed. How much was enough? That depended entirely on the doctor's judgment, which was based on ancient texts and personal intuition rather than any scientific understanding. Some physicians drained pints of blood from already weakened, sick patients, but venesection wasn't the only bloodletting method. Doctors also used cupping and scarification. Scarification involved making multiple shallow cuts across the skin, then placing heated glass cups over the wounds. As the air inside cooled, it created suction that drew blood out through the cuts. This technique was particularly popular in Islamic medicine, where every hammam, steam bath, had a barber and cupper in attendance specifically for this purpose. Then there were leeches, actual living leeches applied to patients' bodies to suck out blood. This was considered the localized method of bloodletting, used when physicians wanted to drain blood from specific body parts rather than systemically. Medieval doctors kept jars full of leeches ready for medical use, and patients would lie still while multiple leeches attached themselves and gorged on their blood. Here's the horrifying reality. Bloodletting killed people. A lot of people. Patients who were already weak from illness would have significant amounts of blood drained, leaving them even weaker and less able to fight infection or disease. Anemia, shock, and death from blood loss were common complications that medieval doctors didn't connect to their treatments. They saw patients die after bloodletting and concluded the disease was simply too severe, never that they'd killed the patient by draining their blood. The practice was so ingrained in medieval medicine that barbers, yes, the same people who cut hair, performed bloodletting as part of their regular services. The red and white striped barber pole we still see today originated from this practice. Red representing blood, white representing bandages, and the pole itself representing the stick patients would grip to make their veins bulge. Every medieval town had multiple barbers who doubled as bloodletters, making the procedure easily accessible to anyone who could pay. Bloodletting was used for everything: infections, drain blood to remove the poisoned humours; inflammation, remove blood to reduce heat; mental illness, obviously caused by excess blood putting pressure on the brain, time to drain some out; women's menstrual problems, men's impotence, children's developmental issues, all treated with bloodletting. The practice persisted well beyond the medieval period, only being discredited in the late 19th century when scientific medicine finally demonstrated that deliberately weakening sick patients by draining their blood was, in fact, a terrible idea. But for centuries, bloodletting was considered standard medical care, prescribed by respected physicians, taught in medical schools, and trusted by patients who paid good money to have their blood drained. Medieval medicine didn't just fail to help people, it actively harmed them, and bloodletting was one of the deadliest examples. If drilling holes in skulls and draining blood weren't horrifying enough, medieval doctors also loved cauterization, the practice of burning patients' flesh with red-hot metal rods or caustic chemicals as a treatment. This wasn't just used to stop bleeding during surgery, which would at least make some practical sense. Medieval physicians burned people's skin as a treatment in itself, believing that applying extreme heat to diseased body parts would somehow cure them. Cauterization was an ancient technique that predated medieval medicine, originating in both the pre-Islamic Near East and ancient Greece. By the medieval period, it had become standard surgical practice across Europe and the Islamic world, performed regularly by barbers, cuppers, and physicians. Every medieval medical encyclopedia included extensive sections on when, where, and how to burn patients. The instruments used were brutally simple: metal rods or pokers heated in fire until they glowed red-hot, then pressed directly against the patient's skin. Alternatively, physicians used caustic chemicals that burned through tissue chemically rather than with heat. Either way, the result was excruciating pain and permanent scarring. So what ailments did medieval doctors treat by literally burning people? Practically everything. Got hemorrhoids? Medieval physicians would burn them with red-hot irons. The logic was that cauterizing hemorrhoids would seal them and prevent future problems. The reality was agonizing pain, severe burns, and often infections that made the original problem seem minor by comparison. Headaches were treated with cauterization, applied to specific points on the skull, based on medieval theories about where pain originated. Joint pain? Burn the joint. Back problems? Apply hot irons to the spine. Abdominal issues? Cauterize the belly. There was essentially no medical condition that medieval physicians didn't think could be improved by burning the affected area. The theoretical basis for cauterization was the same humoral theory that drove bloodletting. Medieval doctors believed that burning flesh would cook out the excess humors causing illness, or that the extreme trauma would somehow shock the body into rebalancing itself. They also thought that creating a wound through cauterization would allow evil humors to escape through the burned opening, similar to how trepanation supposedly released evil spirits. Medieval medical texts gave detailed instructions on cauterization techniques. Physicians were taught exactly how long to hold the hot iron against flesh, how deep to burn, and which body parts required multiple applications. Some texts included diagrams showing dozens of cauterization points across the human body, like a medieval roadmap for where to burn patients. The pain was unimaginable. Remember, medieval medicine had no effective anesthesia. Patients endured these procedures fully conscious. Being held down while someone pressed a glowing metal rod into your flesh, feeling your skin sizzle and smelling your own burning tissue, was pure torture. Yet patients submitted to this because they trusted that physicians knew what they were doing and that the temporary agony would lead to healing. In Islamic medical practice, cauterization was so common that it became a specialized service provided at hammams, public baths, alongside bloodletting and cupping. People would visit the hammam not just for cleansing and relaxation, but specifically to have their bodies burned as preventative healthcare or treatment for chronic conditions. This was considered normal self-care, the medieval equivalent of going to a spa, except instead of a massage, you got seared with hot metal. The most disturbing aspect of cauterization is that it undoubtedly caused far more harm than good. Burns are extremely vulnerable to infection, especially when created with non-sterile medieval instruments and treated with no antibiotics or proper wound care. Many patients who survived the initial cauterization procedure likely died days or weeks later from infected wounds. But again, medieval doctors didn't make the connection between their treatments and subsequent complications. Cauterization also left permanent disfiguring scars across patients' bodies, visible proof of their medical treatments that they'd carry for life. These scars were often extensive, covering large areas of skin with burn tissue. Yet this was accepted as a normal consequence of healthcare. Like bloodletting and trepanation, cauterization persisted for centuries because medieval medicine wasn't based on empirical testing or scientific evidence. It was based on ancient theories, authoritative texts, and the flawed assumption that if patients sometimes survived these procedures, the treatments must be working. The countless patients who died from complications, infections, or shock, they were just too sick to save. Medieval cauterization was torture masquerading as medicine, paid for by patients who desperately wanted healing and received only pain. At this point, you're probably wondering, how could medieval doctors genuinely believe that drilling holes in skulls, draining blood, and burning flesh with hot irons would heal people? The answer lies in understanding the complete absence of scientific method and the domination of ancient medical theory that went unchallenged for over 1,000 years. Medieval medicine was built entirely on the work of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, particularly Hippocrates, 460–370 BC, and Galen, 129–200 AD. Their writings formed the foundation of all medical education throughout the Middle Ages, and questioning their teachings was considered heresy, not just medically but sometimes religiously. When the Catholic Church endorsed these ancient medical theories, challenging them meant challenging church authority. The core of medieval medical theory was the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Medieval physicians believed every human body contained these four fluids, and perfect health meant having them in perfect balance. Any illness, whether physical or mental, resulted from an imbalance of humors. Too much blood, you'd be feverish and energetic. Too much phlegm, you'd be sluggish and cold. Too much bile, you'd be angry or depressed. This theory sounds absurd now, but it was based on observable phenomena that medieval doctors misinterpreted. They noticed that sick people often had visible symptoms involving bodily fluids, coughing up phlegm, vomiting bile, bleeding, sweating. They concluded these fluids must be the cause of illness rather than symptoms of it. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of cause and effect that shaped medical practice for centuries. Once you accept the humoral theory, the logic of medieval treatments becomes clear. Horrifying but clear. If illness is caused by too much blood, then draining blood should restore balance and cure the patient. If evil spirits or excess humors are trapped inside the skull causing headaches or seizures, then drilling a hole provides an escape route. If diseased humors have pooled in a specific body part, burning that area will cook them out. Medieval doctors weren't sadists. They genuinely believed they were healing people. They spent years studying ancient medical texts, memorizing complex theories about humoral balance, planetary influences on health, and the properties of various herbs and treatments. They saw themselves as learned professionals applying sophisticated medical knowledge to save lives. The problem was that their entire knowledge base was wrong, fundamentally, comprehensively wrong. They had no understanding of germ theory, no concept of bacteria or viruses, no knowledge of how blood circulation actually worked, and no idea what the brain actually did. They believed the heart was the center of thought and emotion, that the liver produced blood continuously, and that the brain was just a cooling organ. Without scientific method or empirical testing, medieval medicine couldn't self-correct. When a patient died after bloodletting, doctors concluded the patient was too sick to save, not that draining blood from an already weakened person was a terrible idea. When someone survived trepanation, they credited the procedure, ignoring all the patients who died from infection afterward. This is called confirmation bias, and it trapped medieval medicine in a cycle of harmful practices for centuries. Medieval physicians also had no understanding of the placebo effect or natural recovery. If a patient received bloodletting and recovered, doctors assumed the bloodletting cured them, never considering that the patient might have recovered anyway, or despite the treatment, rather than because of it. Similarly, when patients claimed to feel better after trepanation or cauterization, doctors took this as evidence of effectiveness, not recognizing that trauma and pain can trigger endorphin releases that temporarily mask symptoms. Religious beliefs also played a major role. Medieval Christianity taught that suffering could be redemptive and that illness was sometimes caused by sin or demonic possession. This created a framework where painful medical treatments made spiritual sense. You were literally burning out sin or drilling holes to release demons. Patients accepted horrific procedures partly because they believed the pain had spiritual meaning beyond just physical healing. The medieval medical worldview was self-reinforcing. Ancient authorities like Galen were considered infallible. Religious doctrine supported medical theories. Survivorship bias made harmful treatments seem effective, and the complete absence of alternative explanations meant there was no competing theory to challenge the status quo. Medieval doctors weren't evil. They were trapped in a system of incorrect knowledge that went unquestioned for over a millennium, harming patients while genuinely believing they were healing them. Beyond the brutal surgical procedures, medieval medicine also featured a spectacular array of bizarre remedies that ranged from surprisingly effective to absolutely insane. While trepanation, bloodletting, and cauterization were performed by physicians, everyday medieval people also treated themselves with homemade medicines that combined genuine herbs with utterly ridiculous ingredients. Take, for example, St. Paul's potion, supposedly invented by the apostle himself to treat epilepsy, catalepsy, and stomach problems. The recipe included licorice, sage, willow, roses, fennel, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, 3 kinds of pepper, mandrake, dragon's blood, and cormorant blood. Yes, blood from an actual cormorant, a large water bird. Here's the wild part. Some of these ingredients actually had medicinal value. Licorice treats coughs and bronchitis. Sage improves blood flow to the brain. Willow contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Fennel, cinnamon, and ginger all relieve intestinal gas. But cormorant blood, that was just adding iron for anemia, though any warm-blooded creature's blood would work. Medieval people had accidentally stumbled onto some effective treatments, but couldn't distinguish which ingredients actually helped and which were pointless. Dragon's blood sounds like pure fantasy, but it wasn't mythical beast blood. It was bright red resin from the tree Dracaena draco, native to Morocco and the Canary Islands. Modern research confirms it has antiseptic, antibiotic, antiviral, and wound-healing properties. Medieval people didn't know why it worked, but they'd observed that it did, so it became a prized medicinal ingredient. Mandrake root appears in countless medieval remedies, usually as a sleeping draught or painkiller. It actually works. Mandrake contains powerful sedative compounds. The problem is that it's also poisonous if you use too much, and medieval dosing was based on guesswork rather than careful measurement. So while mandrake could genuinely help with pain and insomnia, it could also kill you if the apothecary wasn't careful. Medieval remedies frequently incorporated animal parts in ways that seem absurd today. Besides cormorant blood, doctors prescribed medicines containing ground-up insects, animal organs, human skull moss, lichen growing on skulls, and even Egyptian mummy powder. The logic was based on the medieval doctrine of signatures, which held that God marked natural objects with visual clues about their medicinal uses. If something looked like a body part or had a certain color, medieval people believed it could treat problems with that body part or condition. Snail poultices were popular treatments for skin conditions and wounds. Patients would literally cover injuries or rashes with crushed snails, believing the slime had healing properties. Surprisingly, modern science suggests snail mucin does have some wound healing and anti-inflammatory effects, which is why it appears in some contemporary skincare products. Medieval people accidentally got this one partially right, even if their theoretical understanding was completely wrong. For infections and inflammation, medieval physicians often prescribed medicines that seem reasonable today. Honey, which has antibacterial properties, garlic, antimicrobial, and various herbs with genuine medicinal compounds. But they'd mix these effective ingredients with bizarre additions like ground pearls, unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, and toad vomit, believing the expensive or rare ingredients enhanced the medicine's power. Medieval medicine also featured treatments based on astrology. Physicians consulted planetary charts before prescribing remedies or performing procedures, believing that celestial bodies influenced bodily humors and treatment effectiveness. A bloodletting performed during the wrong lunar phase was thought to be dangerous, while the same procedure during an auspicious alignment would be beneficial. One particularly strange belief was that diseases could be transferred to other objects or creatures. Medieval people would sometimes press bread against diseased body parts, believing the illness would transfer into the bread, which they'd then dispose of, or sometimes eat, thinking that consuming the bread would complete some mystical healing process. Similarly, warts were cured by rubbing them with meat, then burying the meat. As the meat rotted, the warts would supposedly disappear. Perhaps the most telling aspect of medieval remedies is how they mix genuine medicinal knowledge with complete nonsense, and medieval people couldn't tell the difference. They knew certain herbs helped certain conditions based on centuries of trial and error, but they attributed this effectiveness to humoral theory, astrological influence, or divine signatures rather than biochemistry. This meant that when treatments failed, which was often, medieval physicians would adjust the wrong variables, changing the planetary timing or adding more exotic ingredients instead of questioning whether the fundamental approach was flawed. Medieval medicine was a bizarre blend of accidental effectiveness and dangerous superstition. So there you have it. Medieval medicine wasn't gentle, it wasn't scientific, and it definitely wasn't based on that Hippocratic principle of first, do no harm. Physicians drilled holes through conscious patients' skulls, drained blood from people already weakened by illness, burned flesh with red-hot irons, and prescribed potions containing cormorant blood and dragon's tree resin, all while genuinely believing they were providing cutting-edge healthcare. The treatments were brutal. The theory behind them was completely wrong. And yet medieval doctors were respected professionals who spent years studying ancient texts, learning complex procedures, and charging good money for their services. They weren't monsters. They were intelligent people trapped in a system of incorrect knowledge that went unchallenged for over 1,000 years. Medieval medicine is a powerful reminder that confidence and tradition don't equal effectiveness. Just because something has been done for centuries doesn't mean it actually works. And the next time you complain about getting a shot or taking bitter medicine, remember, at least your doctor isn't coming at you with a drill or red-hot poker. If you enjoyed this disturbing journey through medieval healthcare, hit that like button and subscribe for more historical nightmares that'll make you grateful for modern medicine. Thanks for watching, and stay healthy, the 21st century way.